Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much for coming out on rather a chaotic day in London. And welcome to this new, somewhat experimental format for this room, which is designed to encourage a good discussion. So when the time comes, I do encourage you to take part in the discussion. We're very fortunate to have in this armchair Sir Peter Ricketts, the National Security Advisor. In fact, he's relinquishing the job at the end of the year, inexplicably, to become ambassador in Paris. And so
it's tough for somebody has to do it.
And so it will be very interesting to hear his thoughts today on the National Security Council and his experience of being the first National Security Advisor. He's had a career that's constantly put him in the middle of things, dealing years ago with issues like Hong Kong, the Balkans, especially Kosovo. He was chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee, then he was political director in the FCO in the aftermath of 9/11 as the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq began. And he was ambassador at NATO, and then permanent undersecretary, and then appointed National Security Advisor on the day that the present government took office. On which day the first meeting of the new National Security Council was convened. So during his time, he's overseen the creation of a new national security strategy, of a strategic defence and security review, and then the small matter of the Arab Spring and a war in Libya, and perhaps other things too that have occupied his attention. After he's made his remarks, I'm going to call on Nigel Inkster, my colleague, who's Director of Transnational Threats and Political Risk, to give a few brief responses, and also Brigadier Ben Barry, who's our Senior Fellow for Land Warfare. And then we'll broaden the discussion out. But first, Sir Peter Ricketts.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Alex. Well, first of all, I thought I'd time this just to prove that there is at least one civil servant who's not on strike. Indeed, I can reassure you the national security community is hard at work. Quite a lot of my colleagues in the Foreign Office spent all last night helping to plan for the evacuation of staff out of Iran. So no, we're still hard at it. Thank you very much indeed, everyone. And I hope you don't think this is a sort of late night chat-show format, but I think it will allow plenty of discussion. I'm not going to speak for very long because I'm particularly interested to pick up discussion points that are interesting. I did think, though, that it was a time to come and report to you, really, and talk to you about how this National Security Council has developed in the 18 months that we've been running it, how it works, what sort of issues we've dealt with, and take as a bit of a case study, perhaps, the Libya conflict, and both as a conflict, I mean, some reflections on that, and also how our structure worked in dealing with it. It is quite unusual, I guess, in the British system to be a part of setting up a new piece of Whitehall machinery in the national security area. I do think that this one is here to stay, and therefore I hope it is of interest to talk about how it's worked. Of course, we've had in Whitehall for many years cabinet committees dealing with overseas policy, overseas and defence. It's been called various things over the years. The specificity, I think, of the NSC is that the Prime Minister has chosen this vehicle to be an absolutely systematic meeting, at least weekly, where a whole range of the different foreign and domestic security policy issues come together. And the fact that the Prime Minister chairs it routinely, regularly, the fact that he uses it as a forum to crunch decisions, not just to have sort of wide-ranging discussion, has already attracted Whitehall's attention and meant that people have understood that if you've got an issue that needs ministerial attention in this sort of area, then the NSC is the place to get resolution and to get forward momentum. And it has been systematic, it has been pretty intensive. We're just coming up to around about our 100th NSC meeting at ministerial level this year, 62 of which have been on Libya. So this is unprecedented, I think, in terms of the intensity in which ministers have talked about national security policy and taken decisions, and we've had at least as many, probably more, at my level in the same period. So this has become a new Whitehall centre for policy making on national security. In the process, it's created a community, actually, of ministers who are now used to looking across the whole field. So you've got the Home Secretary involved in discussion about defence issues and foreign policy. You've got the Development Secretary who's there for the discussion of all these issues. The Chancellor and the Chief Secretary, both fully involved. All these ministers, in my experience, not just sticking to their departmental briefs, but ranging more widely and prepared to intervene in the discussion as ministers. And the style of the meetings has evolved as well. I mean, we started off thinking that it should be a classic cabinet committee, the kind you'd recognise from the TV, where Secretary of State comes with a paper, presents his paper, others intervene in a rather gentlemanly way, the Prime Minister sums up in a way pre-scripted by the Cabinet Office, and that's the end of the meeting. It's not like that at all. We rapidly became aware the Prime Minister's view was that this should be a place where a professional presents, so a civil servant or a military officer or the ambassador if we're talking about an individual country. And then a couple of other professionals around the table, the heads of the intelligence agencies, CDS, then comment or are subject to questioning usually. Prime Minister and other ministers question, challenge, probe. Then they have a political discussion and they reach a conclusion. And that works, I think, rather effectively. It actually works better than if a minister presents their own case, at which point other ministers are feeling a bit more constrained about really challenging and getting underneath the issue. So a lot of it depends on the style of the chairmanship, and it has proved a good way of reaching decisions. I'll talk about some of the issues we've treated. I've also briefly mentioned the other creation that we've made, which is this National Security Council at official level, my level, 4-star level, if you like. I found when I was the Perm-Sec of the Foreign Office that Perm-Secs didn't do enough policy in the modern Whitehall. And this has become a forum actually which permanent secretaries really, I think, enjoy and get satisfaction from. A weekly meeting focused on, first of all, on the national security agenda of the NSC, in other words, preparing the papers, ensuring that we're asking the right decisions. But then also it's taken on a life of its own as a place where we can discuss, think rather longer term, more strategic issues, and give policy advice to NSC ministers. So we have a forum there for to allow a little bit more space for thinking than is sometimes possible at the ministerial meeting. So what have we done in the first 18 months? Well, first of all, of course, there was a period of the new government getting to grips with the key issues that they inherited. Afghanistan campaign, first and foremost. I think this is the first transition of government while British forces were in major combat since the Korean War. I can't think of another one on the same scale. So this government had to inherit a major military campaign in the middle of it and understand it, embrace it, decide what they wanted to change. And that was quite a big part of the time in the early weeks and months. A whole range of other pressing national security issues, as you can imagine, issues in Pakistan, Iran, Russia, quite a lot of time on the international security agenda. Counter-terrorism, Minister spent a lot of time both on the policy, including developing a new contest strategy, and on the threat issues, including in Northern Ireland, but also an intensive period last autumn when there were concerns about potential Mumbai-style operations in this country. As you mentioned, the National Security Strategy and the SDSR, which we worked through the NSC. At the same time, the Foreign Secretary has been chairing an NSC Emerging Powers Subcommittee, which has spent a lot of time harnessing the whole of government behind the policy of giving greater emphasis to the emerging markets, the Gulf, Brazil, China, India, and linking up the national security and the economic security agenda there. And then we found it's a very good vehicle for doing work on those awkward cross-cutting issues that don't quite sit in any department. Example, cyber, and the new cyber program that we have running now in the new spending round period. Or another example, the complex of issues to do with justice and security, which led to the creation of the Gibson Inquiry, the publication of the Green Paper on justice and security. A very complex but very important area that the NSC has proved the right shape of format to deal with. And then there's been the Arab Spring. And from last January onwards, this has been a major topic for the NSC. I think we can say that we saw early on that this was essentially a political and economic event rather than an ideological one. And if you look back to the Prime Minister's Kuwait speech in February last year, he was already developing a series of arguments about the importance of reform in the Arab world in order to avoid revolution, and took that message even to the Gulf, which was not the easiest place to deliver it. And Libya, of course, has been then a huge focus of attention since February, March last year. I would not argue that the way we conducted the Libya campaign is necessarily a sort of paradigm for the future conflict resolution, but it was a fascinating case study, actually. I mean, to have a crisis in which the Arab League asks for NATO to intervene, the opposition in an Arab country asks for NATO to intervene. We have a really strong Chapter 7 UN Security Council mandate. We have a NATO operation where the UK and France are leading and the US are deliberately stepping back from lead. Having a coalition that involves Arab nations participating in the bombing of another Arab nation under a NATO flag. I mean, these are all quite groundbreaking. And I think there are things we can learn from it. One of them is that by not having had the sort of invasion that we've had in Afghanistan and Iraq, but working through local forces, supporting them under the UN resolution, has meant that the conflict stabilization period has been very different. I mean, we are seen, I think, genuinely across Libya as having helped the opposition forces at crucial time. The precision air strikes that are now possible with modern weapons meant that there were very few examples of civilians killed in NATO airstrikes. As a result, we do have, I think, an opportunity now to see Libya emerge as a pro-Western, increasingly well-to-do country if they can get their oil revenues flowing. And altogether, I think we can look on this as a successful support to a locally generated initiative. How did the NSC perform through this? I would say that we really did this one by the book. If you look back, we discussed and debated in detail in the NSC. We had full Attorney General advice that was circulated to the entire Cabinet. There was a Cabinet discussion and a decision. There was a parliamentary vote, all on the basis of this very strong UN Security Council resolution. And I think the NSC did prove effective in the coordination of, although it was a limited military campaign, it was a very complex campaign. There were obviously the use of air power in support of local forces on the ground. There was a lot of diplomatic activity, the consular evacuation in the early stages, all the work to do with building a strong support base internationally with the contact group, and then sustaining that through a 6-month campaign. There was a lot of economic activity with sanctions policy, freezing of assets, and then the issues of unfreezing. A lot of detailed work led by DFID on stabilization planning, learning lessons from Iraq. We had elaborate plans ready on the stabilization front, a lot of communications work as well. So very complex, and as a result, the Prime Minister used the NSC intensively to ensure that all of those lines of activity were geared to achieving the political objective that we were seeking, protection of civilian population in support of the opposition groups. And I think that will always be the case now, actually. I mean, we can talk about this in the discussion period, but I think conflict in the modern era, where politicians are required to respond 24/7, where social networking and all these other channels of communication are active, I think it really means that people have to be close to the detail, and small details of the campaign, if they go wrong, can suddenly become major issues. I think the NSC allowed us to handle that in a collegial atmosphere with plenty of challenge, plenty of debate, but clear ministerial direction on the basis of the best intelligence, civil service advice, and military advice from CDS. Of course, we've been thinking about, well, what lessons do we learn from that? And I think the main lesson is that this is a coordination process that worked and that we should use again in future. It taught us again the need to mobilize all of the expertise in Whitehall behind what we were trying to achieve. So, for example, on the oil industry, we put together an oil cell. We tried to look at what the structure of the industry was, how we could support the areas in the west, while at the same time keeping pressure on the main oil-producing areas in the east while they were still under Gaddafi's rule. trying to avoid damaging the complexes. There was a complex set of issues around oil, similarly around sanctions and many other areas as well. And so generating the right groups of people in Whitehall were important. I think we learned that you've got to think very carefully about the UN sanctions that you are pursuing. I think we had a very effective sanctions resolution, but actually, since it was directed really at cutting off economic opportunities for the Gaddafi regime, when we came to be looking to support the newly emerging power of the National Transitional Council, we sometimes found that our own sanctions resolution could become an issue, and we will need to think about that, I think, in future regimes. We need to think also about NATO and the implications for the NATO command structure and the sorts of people we want in key NATO jobs, given that we have found that we may need to be using the NATO system without the Americans necessarily in the lead. Lastly, creativity. You never know with a campaign like this how it will develop, and I think the fact that we had in Qatar and the UAE two really staunch allies who were fully involved in all aspects of the campaign gave us opportunities, particularly when it came to mentoring and training the opposition forces on the ground in Libya that were precious and that we adapted to as we went along. Just to finish and sort of lead on to the next parts of the discussion, what is our national security agenda for the next year? I would say critical issue for the whole community will be the Olympics, which is of course an enormous opportunity for the UK, but will be a real challenge as well for the security community and law and order, and that's going to take quite a lot of time. Afghanistan, we are in the middle now of a complex transition to Afghan forces led, Western forces in support, all heading towards the end of the combat mission by the end of 2014. Pakistan is inseparable from that clutch of issues, and clearly there are going to be some very difficult issues in relation to Pakistan. I think the UK-Pakistan security relationship has been improving. We were there again last week with a strong delegation, but that is going to mean a lot of work, I think, in this coming year. On counterterrorism, the threat constantly shifts and changes. Yemen, Somalia, the Sahel are now of growing importance, and therefore a more complex set of risks. On Somalia in particular, we've called an international conference for the first part of next year to try to integrate all the various strands of activity, from piracy to counter-terrorism to stabilization and encouraging governmental control to helping with the famine. Two other points. The cyber threat. I do think that the government has got ahead of that, and by investing enough in GCHQ and in other parts of the government, we are in a position, I think, to influence the way international thinking develops on cyber. And finally, one shouldn't forget the crisis areas. The Middle East, I think, will go on being a major focus of attention. There may be others that I'm not predicting at the moment, but I think it's safe to say that Iran will never be far from our thoughts. What we've seen in the last 24 hours has been absolutely disgraceful. Our embassy has been trashed. Our people have been, their house has been ransacked. And this, as the Prime Minister said, can't be without consequences, but it's only part of a wider picture of very worrying behaviour from the Iranian regime that I think is going to be a national security issue for the next year. So I think we have a forum here where we've proved that it can be effective in coordinating and driving national security policy. I think it does bring all the various factors together. I think it's here to stay, and it's been a fascinating 18 months to be part of setting it up.
Well, Peter, thank you very much. That's really fascinating account. I think particularly interesting on new ways within government of managing crises. That seems to be a very interesting aspect. Straight over to Nigel Inkster.
Thank you very much, Alex. I will be brief. I mean, I think what this presentation demonstrates is the way in which security culture has shifted within the UK government, perhaps over the past decade, with an awareness of the need to focus on a much wider array of issues than has traditionally been bracketed in the security domain, and with a much wider group of, to use that overworked Whitehall term, stakeholders than has previously been the case. And clearly the new mechanisms that have been described, or something like them, are necessary for dealing with this new approach to security. I think when the NSC started work and it got off to a cracking start, there were some question marks in some of our minds about whether this intensity of activity could be sustained. And I think Gus O'Donnell observed that when you were dealing with a coalition government, you have to have significant levels of process. And the question obviously was whether this could survive beyond a coalition government to one that we're more familiar with. But I have to say that in many senses I'm quite reassured about that. I had 2 points that I wanted to particularly focus on. One was the whole question of national security assessment. We have a national security risk register now, and we've been talking about horizon scanning capabilities as a discipline that needs to be addressed more systematically. I have to say, I thought that your description of the 4-star PUS level committee seemed to me offer very interesting potential for what could be, in a sense, an organic horizon scanning capability, rather than something which takes place, slightly separated from, as a separate exercise from the practicalities of policy work. And from that perspective, I think offers some very interesting potential for developing this capability. The other area I wanted to talk about was the whole question of intelligence support for this apparatus, because it seems to me that the NSC must quite significantly change both the role and the dynamic of the Joint Intelligence Committee assessment staff and the structure that we've been familiar with for quite a long time. Essentially, the National Security Council becomes the kind of Uber consumer customer for the JIC, and I imagine now that more and more of the JIC's activities are going to be focused on supplying this relentless liturgy of NSC activities. I wonder whether, in fact, the assessments mechanisms as we currently have them and the capacities and the resources are, in fact, coping with the kind of demands that you have outlined. And it'd be perhaps interesting in the course of our subsequent discussion to look perhaps at that and consider whether how intelligence structures have changed and whether they need to do more so. I think those are the only points I wanted to make.
Nigel, thanks very much. Ben Barry.
I spent over a third of my military career in the Ministry of Defence, and I developed an abiding interest in how defence was run. So I studied the British government's higher management of World War II and the Falklands War. And I also wrote the British Army's final lesson study of the Iraq War. And as this coincided with the Iraq Inquiry's hearings, I had the dubious privilege of reading all their published evidence and testimony. Now, those of you who've never worked in government or worked in a large delivery organisation may not realise just how difficult strategic decision-making in large organisations can often be, as can be getting things done, the supertanker effect. And this can be doubly so for governments, and doubly so again for wars, especially for wars that are unpopular. But my assessment is the previous war cabinet system imposed by Churchill and then used by Mrs. Thatcher worked pretty well in aligning ends, ways and means at the national level to achieve strategic objectives. But I'm afraid the overwhelming impression of the Iraq Inquiry's evidence is of some sometimes seriously suboptimal strategic leadership management and decision-making, both in the MOD and across Whitehall. And let me just quote from the evidence of General Lord Walker, the CDS, from 2003 to 6. I was always certain that the Prime Minister himself had got it, but I could never be certain that him having got it meant it was actually going to happen lower down. Trying to get things to happen at the far end was difficult. I had a word for this, the mattress mice. Somehow, from the order being given at the top to its arrival at the bottom, the mattress mice got at it and diluted it to an extent that it didn't happen in the way the lever puller at the top had anticipated. And many of my in the army and other services sometimes form similar views. Now, the good news is that my friends in government, and particularly in the MOD, welcome the way that, as Sir Peter has described, the existence and work of the National Security Council has forced government departments to cooperate much more by design rather than by chance. And they welcome that decisions have been made and direction given in a timely fashion, including, importantly, which government department is to get its checkbook out to pay for particular activities. And there is a universal sense that I get that the Council has added great value to the direction and coordination of the UK's effort in Libya. But the one thing, Sir Peter, it will be interested to hear a bit more about is the making sure things happen subsequent to the decision being made, especially where they involve a multiplicity of agencies. Your example of the oil operation in Libya was very encouraging, but are there others you'd want to share with us to show that the Security Council is doing its best to exterminate those mattress mice that so vexed Lord Walker?
Thank you, Ben. Well, a number of issues raised already. I'm going to open it up now and take a number of interventions. If I call on you, could you please wait for the microphone? And if I don't identify you already, identify yourself. So David Oman, in the front rows here.
David Oman. First, Peter, congratulations on what you've achieved. Two quick questions, if I may. Where do you personally see the boundary of what counts as national security? For example, the riots in the summer, future prospect of disorder. Is that national security? And secondly, as you've described, and the Brigadier has said, the model you've been operating is the Thatcher War Cabinet model, where the proposition is put forward by the professional and then debated by the minister. Do you think that will work for much more strategic discussion of long-term issues? How do you see that discussion working out?
Okay, and Nick Childs.
Nick Childs from the BBC. So Peter, you set out the lessons learned and how the NSC has developed. As Alex said, you're the first national security advisor. I wonder if you could say a bit more about how your own role has developed and the lessons you've particularly learned, particularly as you pass on your baton. The NSA here is a rather different creature than, say, in the United States, for example, and although you say the NSC has become a driver in Whitehall, there are those who have suggested that to make it even more of a driver, a different type of national security advisor at a political level might be something to think of as the future. Your thoughts on that? Yep. Thank you.
Thanks. I'll give Peter a chance in just after one more question to answer some of those questions immediately. But the gentleman over there.
Bill McLean from Reuters. I'd like to know, has there been any discussion in the NSC of the implications for the UK of a Eurozone breakup, including but not limited to civil disorder?
Okay, well, that's a lot on your plate
okay.
already.
All right, very good. We're off and running. Excellent. Let me just pick up a few, because it's the debate that I'm interested in. Nigel makes a very good point about intelligence support to the NSC. And clearly, the arrival of the NSC is a big change in the landscape for the JIC, not least because it gives the heads of intelligence agencies very regular access to ministers in their decision-making setting of a kind which they haven't had before, I don't think. I think the chairman of the JIC typically went to meetings of the cabinet committees, but the agency heads are there as well. So that's one issue. The other is, as you say, the systematic, you said relentless drive of the agenda. Yes, we are the uber consumer, I think, for intelligence products. In other words, the JIC has a rather easier job now in deciding what it should focus on, because it can take the forward agenda of the NSC and aim, a month or 6 weeks ahead to be beginning to prepare papers for the upcoming NSC discussions. And I think it's a golden opportunity for the JIC, because instead of perhaps finding the red book in the bottom of the Prime Minister's weekend box to leaf through if he got to it on Sunday afternoon, we are now taking JIC papers as a fundamental part of NSC discussions. So I think JIC relevance is growing. We are trying to ensure it's not too much of a load for the staff, but I think it's plugged intelligence assessment more closely into the policy forming process, which I think is a good thing. And on Ben's point, I can certainly reassure you that NSE discussions are they're collegial, they are minuted, it's all done around the same table, and they are progress chased, if there is such a word. And I think part of the point of having intensive NSE discussions is that the Prime Minister can come back on the next occasion and say, now, I remember that I asked for this, this and this to be done. Has it been done? If not, why not? Which is a rather Churchillian approach, that you keep asking the question until you get an answer that satisfies you. So it is a vehicle for doing that. David, where are the boundaries of national security strategy? I mean, I think you can draw the boundaries in a number of different places. We have tended not to take into the NSC issues of sort of domestic law enforcement. So the disturbances last summer were treated in a meeting that wasn't in the NSC actually, but obviously the Home Secretary and the police have their own operational powers in that area, and it was done in a smaller group rather than the full NSC. So we've tended not to involve that sort of law and order issue, but we certainly have done counter-terrorism, which has both a foreign and a domestic flavour. I mean, I suppose my rule of thumb would be that we have to be looking at issues which have a broad cross-departmental flavour to them, really, so that it's worth assembling that full group of ministers and applying that laser to it. But I think the boundary is arguable, and you can shift it. Will the model of this NSC work for longer-term strategic discussion? I think actually this NSC officials group is quite a good format to do the longer-term strategic. It is quite difficult, has always been, to get ministers to find the time in their busy lives to focus on things which are not immediate and operational, and to think about the longer-term underlying. Whereas I think this officials group can do that. So I'm hoping to move it in that direction. NSA role, is the NSA rightly graded as a senior civil servant, I guess is the question there. I mean, first of all, I think the NSA role, as I've developed it, has three hats. It has running the NSC machine and being the secretary of the NSC, ensuring it's discussing the right things and that there's a flow of papers coming forward, posing the right questions. There is the role of foreign policy advisor to the Prime Minister. I'm not the only one doing that, because there are also private secretaries in number 10, but I've travelled with the Prime Minister, I've been at his main meetings, I've been an advisor to him. And then there's a third role, which is covering a broader spread of issues in the Cabinet Office. For example, I'm the principal accounting officer for the intelligence budget. I'm the line manager for the heads of intelligence agencies, so I have a coordinating role. It used to be the Cabinet Secretaries, but Cabinet Secretary thought, I think, with the creation of this role, it made more sense for this job to closer into the work of the intelligence agencies to take on that. And then other fascinating parts of the national security apparatus in the Cabinet Office, like the Civil Contingencies Secretariat, dealing with domestic resilience in case of floods, fires, famines, industrial protests, and everything else. So I have that wider sort of management. I was asked, have we discussed the Eurozone in the National Security Council? Answer, no, we have not. But it is something we'll be discussing, the potential national security implications in the Eurozone in my officials group in the next week or two.
Thank you very much. I'm going to open it up again for another round of interventions, so if you do want to intervene, then do please catch my eye. First of all, the gentleman here in front row.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hosni Imam, Egyptian journalist. What lessons have you learned, Sir Peter, from the failure of intelligence services, West, East, wherever, to predict the Arab Spring? And what is your assessment now of where it has gone so far? Thank you.
Thank you. And then Lord Gilbert in the far corner there.
If I could just supplement one or two things Peter Ricketts said about Libya without in any sense trying to correct what he said. The Libyan operation could not have been carried out without the enormous investment by the United States. We probably put more resources into it than anybody else.
Yes.
Secondly, what is not so widely known, enormous help from the Italians, mainly ground-based.
Yes.
And thirdly, those that Peter naturally did not commit himself to one of these solecisms, there were boots on the ground, there were NATO boots on the ground, there were British boots on the ground in considerable numbers from when the whole thing started. I'm just trying to deal with some of the myths. If I could ask Sir Peter, in the UK we have what I think is a very healthy value for the role of the opposition. We have the chairman of the PAC as a member of the opposition party. A lot of people think that the chairman of the Intelligence and Security Committee, I included, should be a member of the opposition party. In what he's described for us for the operations of the NSC, there's no role at all that I heard. Forgive me if I misheard him, but for a contribution from the opposition side, and I think that is something we ought to be considering. Finally, as it's been widened out today to discussion of the Eurozone, there was a very senior American military official who said earlier this week in a private meeting in this town that he woke up every morning worried about Israel and Iran, and spent most of his time trying to stop the Israelis doing what we all know they love to do. Are you talking about that? Because it has huge implications for our security, just as the relations between Pakistan and India do. Sorry to have spoken so long.
No, fine.
Thank you. Gentleman in the front row here.
Hi, Duncan Gardam, security correspondent at The Telegraph. I was just wondering how the structure of the NSA and your deputies worked this time last year, when there was some talk about where the cargo bomb crisis was concerned. There was a lack of communication possibly between the various countries involved, America, Dubai, Saudi Arabia, Yemen and that sort of things, and there was some discussion about whether the Prime Minister was brought into the discussion early enough, and some surprise in some quarters when Obama suddenly stood up and started talking about quite how serious it was.
Thank you. Lord Hennessy.
Thank you, Chairman. The Prime Minister said in Parliament the other day that he was using, Peter, the NSC model for other cabinet committees. The post-riots social committee he set up, he said, was based on the NSC. Do you think it is indeed transferable technology in the way the Committee of Imperial Defence actually became the War Cabinet in 1916? Do you think it's not just going to survive, it's becoming the new model for other things?
Okay, shall I have a go at those?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. First of all, failure of the intelligence not to predict the Arab Spring. I always think it's rather hard on the intelligence community to always blame them for failures of intelligence when an event happens which in itself was not predictable. I mean, the event in Tunisia, which was the trigger for the uprisings, was not predictable. Had the intelligence community predicted that there was a state of tension in many Arab countries, that there were problems of governance, that there were economic problems? Yes. I think all the assessments would have shown that, not just in the intelligence community, but in the academic community as well. There was a lot of writing about the failure of the Arab world to develop more open systems, more transparent, the problem of corruption, the problem of people making their voice heard. I think those problems were well known. What nobody could predict, I think, reasonably, was the moment at which something happened that triggered that off. But I think that will always be the case. It's always easy with hindsight to look back and say all the elements were there and we just failed to know that something would happen one day that would trigger it off. So I don't think I regard it as an intelligence failure. Indeed, I think I would like to pay tribute to the intelligence community for the speed with which they were able to tune back into events in a country like Libya when the crisis hit there, and to find that they were able to provide, without breaking any secrets, some very useful information for the government through this crisis. Lord Gilbert, role of the opposition. And the Prime Minister did say at the outset that he wanted to invite the leader of the opposition from time to time to the NSC in a sort of war cabinet spirit, particularly on Afghanistan, and we have done that. No doubt we could do it more, but we have had both the former leader of the opposition and the current leader of the opposition to the NSC for a discussion of Afghanistan. And there are a number of informal discussions that take place as well. So I take your point, but we have done that, and we will continue to do that. And I can reassure you, yes, that we are paying extremely close attention to Iran, not just over the recent incident, but the whole issue of Iran and the nuclear program and the risk that creates is a major item on our agenda. Yes, absolutely. The cargo-based bomb. Well, I mean, the most important thing to say about it is that information was received from one of our intelligence partners, and the cargo bomb was found and was defused, and was quite close to exploding. So, I think actually, strategically, that showed the counterterrorism community working. And this was it's quite a complex case, from Yemen to the Gulf, from the Gulf to Europe, different directions, and then to the UK. Of course, everything, you can always look back and say you could have done things faster and better, but I think the system worked. It's a very good example of just how complex the issue is, because if you put a cargo package into the international cargo system now, it's extremely hard to predict exactly what routes it will take and which airports it will travel through on the way to its destination. So spotting that is quite a complex task. I would argue that overall this was a success for the counterterrorism community, although no doubt things could always have been done better.
The question really is, did the PM know sooner?
Yeah, well, we explained at the time what happened. Yes, there was not a problem about communication. I mean, maybe the PM could have been told a few minutes earlier, but the important thing was that we dealt with the incident successfully and safely, and the system proved that it worked. Peter asks whether the model of an NSC is transferable to more domestic policy issues. I think it probably is, and so much of it depends on the style of the chairman, this kind of thing. If you have the same sort of very operational, focused chairmanship, which is interested in getting results and then ensuring that the decisions are followed up and chased through and confirmation had that they're being implemented, I think that model can apply elsewhere, yes.
Thanks. I mean, the question of predictability of events was raised, and I just wondered whether Nigel wanted to comment.
Yeah, okay, very briefly. I mean, we're talking here about the old distinction, the R.V. Jones point about the difference between secrets and mysteries here. Secrets, things which essentially can be, the answer can be found with luck and persistence, and mysteries, where there are so many imponderables and uncertainties and contingencies where it's virtually impossible to be able to predict with any certainty. The classic case that's always cited is the so-called failure to spot the collapse of the Soviet Union. Well, I mean, people predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1930s, but the process defied gravity for much longer than anybody could possibly have imagined. And even up to the denouement, who could have anticipated the point when Gorbachev turned to Shevardnadze and said, "We can't go on living like this"? Gorbachev himself probably didn't have that thought until pretty much the moment he uttered it. So one has to recognize that there are limits here. Intelligence can deal with mysteries to some degree by helping policies minimize and reduce the element of uncertainty and try to put, so to speak, odds on particular outcomes, but it's, I think, illusory to imagine that it can reliably predict in this sort of circumstances. This is not really what it's for.
What about the invasion of Kuwait?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Invasion of Kuwait.
Well, the invasion of Kuwait, that was an answer where there were secrets which could be elucidated. There were preparations, there were plans, but even here, I'll give you another example, which is perhaps better, which is the Argentine invasion of the Falklands in the early 1980s. Now, here too, there were some signals, but actually, if one looks at the history of that event, the junta that put together that invasion did it so quickly and with so little planning that it had within it the seeds of its own failure. And that, in some degree, explains how the preparations were not seen in time or read correctly to the extent that they were identified.
If I can raise a question, and then we'll come back to the audience. You have had the experience of a war in this past year, but of course there are still ongoing situations in Afghanistan and to a lesser extent Iraq from a British point of view. But I just wonder, looking back over your experience of previous systems, if you like, in previous wars, how would the handling of the Afghanistan situation, for example, and perhaps the Iraq situation, have been different under the new National Security Council, National Security Advisor structure? Can you think of ways in which they would have been different? I'll let you think about that for a moment and come to the gentleman in the front row here.
Yes, I'm Trevor Taylor from Rusty this week. The question about the nature of security, I mean, I think the academic debate on this is very broad, and the crude comment that I often made was that the sort of security agenda was the very important issues agenda, and you couldn't conceive of a very important issue not being a security issue in some of the academic literature. On the other hand, you've got the sort of notion that security is really centred on armed force of one sort or another. And now you've brought in this sort of third dimension, which is it's a multidisciplinary issue, so it needs lots of ministers around. The agenda that you actually gave all involved issues that I would say involved, if you like, malice of one description or another. Cyber, not quite violent malice, but the agenda for next year is all about things that involve malice. And my question is really, can you imagine the National Security Council taking on issues that didn't involve some kind of malice? Because I think then this is sort of quite significant for the message that would feed back into wider debates about the nature of security.
Thank you. Gentleman right there.
My name is Dick Hensley. I'm an ex-serviceman and a Whitehall warrior with Brigadier Ben for a period. Some, like me, may have heard some quite trenchant criticism of strategic decision-making in Whitehall in the recent past. Some of that criticism implies, for example, that the service chiefs might conflate the interests of their own service with the interests of the country, that permanent secretaries in involved departments have done too little policy-making and be too little involved. And on the other hand, Gwyn Prince wrote a rather interesting article about the British way of strategy making that said actually the service chiefs and CDS have been too little involved in making strategy of late. So there's two very opposed views, and I wondered, Sir Peter, given your not only your recent experience at the NSC but also previously, what view you would take of those two rather opposed views.
Thank you. And then finally for this round, gentleman there, yeah. Just here in the third row.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mariusz Sus from the Polish Embassy. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on international outreach of NSC Secretariat. I refer here especially to agreement or decision announced when President Obama was here, and that there was established some joint board of strategic thinkers and so on. So it just, if you could elaborate on it. Thank you.
Right. Okay.
Yes, please. And then Ben, I'd like to come to you after Peter to talk about sort of military involvement in strategy setting.
Fine. Alex, your question, would the handling of, say, Afghanistan have been different over the last year or 18 months without the NSC?
Or even earlier, actually.
Or even earlier. Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't particularly want to criticise the way things were done in the former government. I was a senior official then as well, and I think former governments have given a lot of attention to Afghanistan. They've tended to do it, I think, in a specific Afghanistan setting. So there's been effectively a group of ministers who've dealt with Afghanistan rather than having Afghanistan as part of a wider national security landscape. I'm not sure that any recent government has given it the intensity of engagement that this government has. The frequent, systematic treatment of it in the NSC with a lot of challenge and probing and discussion. And I suspect that all policy is better for that. And I suspect some of the decisions that we've taken over the last 7 or 8 years could probably have benefited from the NSC treatment of being put through the mangle, as it were, until ministers were satisfied that they got the answers. And that's easier to do, I think, if you've got something like a National Security Council structure, which allows senior ministers to come back to the issue, you know, a number of different times until they've got the answer. So I would hope that what is different now is that policy is thoroughly challenged, decisions are tested in rigorous debate, and therefore I hope all the different angles are covered. And maybe I could just pick up there the point about involvement of chiefs and permsecs in strategy making. NSC, we have the Chief of Defence Staff there all the time, who's a prominent member and an extremely well-respected member. We don't have the individual service chiefs, but we do have CDS and the support structure that he has, and also at my officials level meeting, the CDS comes or one of his deputies. So he is there, you know, at the core of strategy making. The permsecs through my official level group are very much more involved as well. And I think my answer to your question is that, you know, given the complexity and difficulty of getting to the right policy or strategy these days, you need the best brains yoked to it, whether it's they sit in the committee or, you know, they work it out with CDS before he comes so that he can represent their views, is a secondary point. But I think we are trying to involve as many of the most experienced people around Whitehall as possible in this policy making process, because I think it's better if you do it that way round. Where you draw the boundaries on security policy, I don't myself think that there's a hard and fast rule. You're right that most of what we do is intended to prevent harms coming to this country, whether military action or intelligence or diplomatic opposition to what we're trying to do. There's one area of the NSC's work that isn't so much to do with malice, and that's what I described the NSC Emerging Powers Subcommittee, which the Foreign Secretary's been chairing, which has taken really the remit to engage the whole of government in essentially ensuring that Britain is properly connected to the economies of the future. So it's tried to coordinate our real push towards improving the relationship with the Gulf countries, which I think has been noticeable over the last 18 months, or countries like India or China or Brazil or Southeast Asia. And they therefore tend to work more on commercial and economic opportunities and ensuring that the obstacles to those are cleared out of the way rather than the sort of risk-based preventing harms coming to this country. So I think we've got a reasonably broad definition, but by the time you get to the economic issues like the Eurozone crisis, then this government has concluded that they need to treat those separately in a different grouping because the particular expertise you have around the table in the NSC is a bit less relevant to that. But all these things are, as I say, debatable, I think. And just to answer our Dutch colleague's question about outreach, I spend an awful lot of my time, I should have said as part of my job, on the phone to international counterparts, whether it's Tom Donilon in Washington or many other national security advisors. We do have a constant stream of visitors as well from other countries coming to exchange ideas with us or look at how we do things. The joint strategy board you mentioned with the Americans was an idea that we would put the planning communities together in Washington and London to produce some pieces of work together to try and see if we could add value by joining up our two planning structures. We're still working on the first 2 or 3 examples of that, but it's not a kind of standing group. It's a link up between the 2 planning communities.
Thank you. Ben, did you just want to comment on the military involvement?
If you wouldn't mind, the higher management of defence in the UK is very advanced along a particular track. That is setting up an integrated joint military-civilian central staff. And there are a whole load of other countries that haven't gone nearly as far down that track. And in my judgment, they probably manage defence less effectively and particularly can't make the hard choices between advocacy from particular services. No system is going to be perfect, but my sense is that many of the reforms that were announced by Liam Fox and are to be executed by his predecessor, I personally think are going in the right direction. That's not really the subject of this meeting. What I think is really important is this business that at times there has to be a really serious dialogue between the Chief of Defence the military advisor to the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister himself. And for example, this is brilliantly described in Elliot Cohen's book Supreme Command, where he analyses the relationship between Grant and Lincoln and Churchill and Allenbrook in this way, and you can do no better than read those two chapters. But I think at really decisive points, the national leader is going to want to look not just the CDS, but the CDS's team in the eye. And if you want, and really sort of reassure himself that the risks are as well accounted for and managed as it can be. And if you want two recent examples, it's the decisive moment in the Falklands War where the go, no-go decision has to be made for the land invasion. And Mrs. Thatcher looks the CDS and the chiefs in the eye and asks them all to tell her, is this feasible or not? And interesting enough, in the Iraq inquiry, in the planning for the invasion about 4 or 5 weeks before, there is the minutes, lightly redacted, of a similar meeting between Tony Blair and the Secretary of State and the CDS and the service chiefs, where, for example, is this a winning plan? What are the key risks? And what are some of the identifiable what-ifs, positive and negative, that sort of measures up in gravity of discussion and the Prime Minister looking the chiefs in the eye. But the key relationship is, the Prime Minister to the CDS, and then it's for the CDS to manage his chiefs and his operational team to make sure he's giving the best advice to the Prime Minister. Not easy. I mean, I really would emphasise this is really big boys stuff and requires big people with experience of making hard decisions and making things happen afterwards.
Ben, thank you. Peter, I'd like to come back to one issue that you mentioned in your original remarks, which is the issue of cyber. The issue of cyber defence, and I wonder, because this seems to be the kind of issue which actually challenges the whole way in which government is organised, potentially, looking towards the future. And I wonder if you would like to just talk about how you see the impact of the need for cyber defence and perhaps even cyber offence to affect the way government is organised. And I'd like to also ask Nigel the same question, and then perhaps others might want to come in on this issue.
Shall I just say a few words? I mean, I'm not the expert on it, but cyber is one of those issues where we're still grappling for the concepts, I think. In some ways, it reminds me a bit of the sort of handling nuclear weapons in the early stages of deterrence. We're still trying to get the construct which will allow us to deal with this. I mean, cyber is obviously a huge opportunity. Every government, every part of government, every part of the private sector wants to be digitally enabled, public services online, access to the citizen. The cyber world is vital to our future economic prosperity. At the same time, it's a risk because, with greater connectivity comes greater vulnerability, and that is also true for the private sector as much as for the government sector. So none of these questions can only be addressed at government. I think government has particular vulnerabilities. I mean, it's an enormous store of data, including data on individual citizens as well as highly classified data, and it's a major mover and shaker on this, but the private sector has huge responsibilities as well to ensure that their cyber defences are up. And I think a lot of the private sector have had some quite nasty surprises in the last year or two when they've discovered their vulnerability to cyber penetration. We are very fortunate that we have a world leader in cyber defence through GCHQ, which has seen this coming and has begun to turn a lot of its effort. I mean, we're speaking in the presence of former director, but I think probably since your time, David, it's really moved towards the cyber threat and has invested in it and understands it probably as well as anyone in the world. And so we are looking to reinforce that success with further investment. But of course, it's got to cover the whole of government, and government has got to be much better at outreach to the private sector, because in the end, probably the innovations that will really serve to protect us in the cyber domain will come from the private sector, and they have as strong an incentive as we do. So, I mean, that's, I think we're at the early stages of that. We had a conference in London the other month designed to try and get other countries thinking about this as well, including our friends in Russia and China, who also share an interest with us in a safe digital space for their own citizens. But I think we're only at the start of really understanding this.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Nigel?
I mean, I think I agree with that. This is an area where the technology and, so to speak, operational art has gone far ahead of policy making, and it's inevitable that policy making is taking some time to catch up. Where just last week, the government launched the second iteration of a national cybersecurity strategy, the first one having been, I think, 2009. The fact that we have a new document coming out so soon after the early one is not, I think, a criticism of the earlier document, but simply a reflection of the complexity of the issues and the reality that thinking in how to deal with them is necessarily evolving all of the time. And I think the UK government has positioned itself, I think, quite well in this, in recognising in this new document that there are very severe limits on what government itself can actually do, because it doesn't control most of the hardware, software and intellectual property that makes up the cyber domain, and it has to work in positive, creative ways and to create an enabling environment and to incentivize the private sector in desirable courses of behavior. Some of this could be done through legislation, through fiat, but the complexity and rapid evolution of the sector probably does not lend itself to that approach. So I think this more hands-off approach that the government has adopted makes a lot of sense. I think the last thing we need is to have a government, or dare I say UN committee, to try and manage the cyber domain, because the government or committee or UN committee could never have created the cyber domain. I can't see how they're going to be able to manage it. That said, of course, we've had this initial burst of 15, 20 years of what one might term chaotic creativity in the cyber domain. The time is coming where we do clearly need some, shall we say, greater structure, some rules of the road, and a lot of thoughts being given to that. The UK is in the lead. We have got some quite significant global divisions of opinion as to what direction this process should take. Some countries emphasize information security. Others, like the UK, talk about network integrity. And this is going to be, I think, a very difficult gap to bridge. There are some quite powerful and fundamental ideological issues that need to be addressed here. This is going to take time.
Thank you very much. Well, if there's nobody else that would like to intervene, I'll just ask Peter if he wants to make any final comments.
Well, no, other than that, I think this is a debate that we should continue, because I think the way our national security structure has evolved is of interest, and I think we should maintain the dialogue. I failed to answer. Somebody asked me a question about whether my job should be done by a minister, effectively, whether it should be at the political level, like the National Security Advisor in the US. The National Security Advisor in the US is very much a presidential staffer, but is a staffer of a different kind. He's got 50 years of institutional evolution behind him, and I gather that he actually chairs meetings of ministers in Washington. When the President isn't there, the National Security Advisor chairs, and the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defence sit there under his chairmanship. We have not reached that point in the UK, and that's probably a good thing.
Right, well, I'd like to thank you very much indeed, Peter, for sharing your insights on the experience of the National Security Advisor and the National Security Council. I'd also like to thank my colleagues Nigel and Ben, but let's all thank Sir Peter for his really interesting remarks.
Thank you, Alex.
No, thank you. Yeah,
thank you very much indeed.